This is the All About 80s Music podcast with John Micek and Steve Augello.
Hey, this is Steve Augello, and I'm here with John Micek.
Happy Saturday, Steve.
Happy Saturday to you, John. And today we'll be debating which is the better year in music, 1983 or 1984. Two landmark years in music that define the 80s. This is going to be a tough one, so let's not waste any time and get right into it. So, John, in one corner, we have 1983 bringing huge hits, In a Big Country, Blue Monday, Saved by Zero, Everything Counts in Large Amounts, Blister in the Sun, Pass the Dutchie, Sweet Dreams, Karma Chameleon, and so many more. And in the other corner, we have 1984, where we saw the Reflex, Safety Dance, Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, Footloose, Ghostbusters, Jump by Van Halen, Jump by the Pointer Sisters, Spandau's True, How Soon Is Now, Killing Moon, Like a Virgin, and so many others. All phenomenal songs. So looking at those two historic years of music, John, what are your initial thoughts?
You know, Steve, when people talk about the 1980s, when they think about the 1980s, they talk about, and you're right, these 2 years. You just ran down this extraordinary list of albums and singles and artists who broke out nearly 40 years ago as we sit here and record today. Those very fertile 2 years are what people think of when they think about the 1980s. I would also say, I think, though, that with the passage of time, our image of that decade, of those 2 years in particular, has become kind of skewed. There's a bit of a now that's what I call 80s vibe to it, because you're putting the Smiths alongside Duran Duran, you're putting The Cure alongside Hall & Oates, you're putting REM alongside Culture Club, and I think it's important to remember and to rewind and to remember just how bifurcated that decade was as well. You didn't hear REM on pop radio. You didn't hear The Cure played in America's Top 40 next to Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? You didn't hear Depeche Mode played alongside Spandau Ballet. I mean, if you were a teenager in 1983, 1984, and you wanted to find those songs, you really had to go look for them. You needed to have an older brother who was in the know and listening to college radio, or you had to have a friend in England who knew about this stuff. And when you wanted to get those records, you had to send away for them in the mail and wait sometimes weeks for them to arrive. So as much as we sort of lump all those songs together, I think it's really important to remember that decade, those 2 years, were hardly monolithic.
And I agree with you on that. But you know, it's funny, we took a lot of curveballs in the 80s as far as music goes, because you think about the German songs from Falco and Nina, who were top 10 hits, basically, right? Or Kenny G's instrumental song, or Bobby McFerrin's like a cappella song. You know, there were a lot of curveballs thrown in the 80s in popular music that people were very accepting. So even though things were compartmentalized or kind of separated out into different formats, as you alluded to, it was a very all-encompassing decade, I think.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, it was a very weird time. You could have 99 Luftballons by Nina. You could have Too Shy by Kajagoogoo, which came out in 1983. You could have Send Me an Angel from Real Life, the Australian man, in 1983. You could have The Politics of Dancing by Reflex. Just a new song by Howard Jones. Just a lot of stuff that was coming at you all at once. So it really was, I mean, I agree, it was a really polymathic decade. And that's because the music industry at that time was just awash in cash. As someone who worked in the industry, I am sure you are well aware of that. Once those bands broke, someone wanted to go out and sign the next Culture Club. They wanted to go out and sign the next Duran Duran. They wanted to go out and sign the next Spandau Ballet. So we got a lot of chancers, some of who made some great records, some of who made like maybe one single and then disappeared. But it really was, yeah, you're right. It was a decade known for its heterodoxy, definitely.
And I think MTV played a lot into that, because for a number of years in the early 80s, they just played like everything throughout the hour. They just played whatever they had, lumped all the videos in together, one after the other. You never know what was coming next. But then I think in the 90s, that's where they started separating everything out. You know, it was kind of nice in the 80s. You got exposed to just a lot of different music that you wouldn't normally listen to in all the subgenres of pop and rock because of MTV. So people of our generation are really, I would say, like well versed in, I don't know, how would you?
No, I think you're right. MTV bowed in what, 1981, 81, and suddenly found itself with 24 hours a day of programming to fill and maybe 6 hours of video with which to fill it. So you had bands sending stuff over willy-nilly from England, from Australia, from Ireland, from Europe. And then alongside that, you had programs like Night Flight on USA Network that were sort of breaking out lesser known artists. I mean, I think the one thing I would pause to point out, though, is that, as we've been talking about these bands, the one thing that's sort of common to them is the whiteness of the artists. For all of the decades, musical diversity, it still took a little while before rap penetrated the mainstream, which was then in its dawning, before R&B really penetrated and breaking away from formatted radio. And MTV rightfully took a lot of grief back in those days for not elevating those artists in the same way, because there are a lot of amazing records being made at that time by Black artists who weren't Michael Jackson and who weren't Lionel Richie, but who were not gaining the same traction as those big names were.
You mentioned a lot of great songs coming out of those 2 years, and it was such a fertile, like you mentioned, it was such a fertile time. Those 2 years specifically, because you had Kajagoogoo, The Police, Men at Work, Hall & Oates, Electric Avenue, Rock the Casbah, Stepping Out by Joe Jackson. You had Journey, you had Van Halen. It was, those 2 years were so fantastic. You know what the thing I found really interesting about the 80s in general, and 83 and 84 specifically, we saw the explosive growth of the big 70s artists that had huge careers in the 80s as well. And David Bowie and Stevie Wonder come to mind initially because they were two artists who were big in the 70s, but then took on this whole new career in the 80s and really just had fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, they too were elevated by video. I mean, you can think about Bowie's Let's Dance video. You can think about Bowie's China Girl video. You can think about Part-Time Lover, the Stevie Wonder tune. All of the videos, I can close my eyes and images of those videos come rushing by. You can make a decent argument, I think, that Let's Dance was Bowie's really last great commercial moment. He continued to be vital well into the 2000s, but I don't think ever really reached that same commercial apex ever again. He was such a polymath. His career took so many strange left turns. He was in the Tin Machine Band for a little while. There were a couple of retrospective tours like the Sound and Vision tour. His last record before he passed was somber and lovely and beautiful. But I think with Let's Dance, he really captured something on record. And you can put a lot of that down, I think, to Nile Rodgers' production, who was poking and prodding Bowie to go in different directions. You listen to Modern Love, you listen to Let's Dance, you listen to China Girl, a song co-written, by the way, with Iggy Pop. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention that. It was a really adventurous record, and then he rushed back into the studio for Tonight less than a year later, cranked out Blue Jean, and then that record kind of flopped. Nile Rodgers, talking to Gary Kemp on the Great Rock on Tours podcast, did mention that Bowie was kind of not present for those sessions, that he was tired and the songwriting wasn't coming in the same way. But with Let's Dance, it was really something quite special. And it's funny, I think in the early 80s, still you had artists who had a foot between two stools. You were just near enough to the 70s to have sort of that veneer of big album rock left over. Paul McCartney put out, what was it, Tug of War with That's Michael Jackson and Say. He put out Pipes of Peace with Stevie Wonder a couple of years, or rather with Ebony and Ivory on it with Stevie Wonder a couple of years earlier. You had Van Halen putting out big rock records, a band that got its start in the 1970s. 38 Special inexplicably had big hits. You had Night Ranger, also kind of a big rock, a big 80s rock band with the feet firmly planted in the 70s. So you did have that sound kind of embedded in the fabric of the decade.
It's embedded, but I got to tell you, Niall really did a great job of transforming himself from the 70s disco god that he was to a whole new different sound. And I know that Bernard and Tony from Chic played into that. But I just think it's amazing that he did this complete transformation to a total different sound on Bowie's Let's Dance album. And he also did it for Madonna's album as well. So when we look at 70s artists who actually made the transition to the 80s and really did a great job doing it, I mean, I think Niall led the charge in that with Bowie's album and Madonna's.
Yeah, I mean, Niall produced probably one of my favorite records of the 1980s, and one that does not get nearly enough credit. He was all over the swing by In Excess, and the single from that record. This is pre Listen Like Thieves, pre Kick, before they went into the stratosphere, and he produced Original Sin, which was this really deep, dense funk single, and that was when Rogers and Chic made that transition from recording artists to support musicians and producers, and really did put their thumbprints on some amazing records in that era. I mean, heck, just a couple of years later in 1985, Bernard Edwards and Tony Thompson would be all over the Power Station record that John Taylor and Andy Taylor from Duran Duran threw together with the late great Robert Palmer on vocals. So, I mean, I think you're right. In a lot of ways, Nile Rodgers was essential to the sound of the earlier part of the decade.
And I want to mention something to you about David Bowie's China Girl song, right? Did you ever hear Iggy's version of that song?
I have. Yep.
So if somebody said to you, John, show me a great song that was remade, like totally different, it would have to be China Girl, because Iggy's version was just like, it was night and day. And when you look at, some of the songs that like didn't have to be remade, when Taylor Swift remade George Michael's Last Christmas, it really didn't do anything to the song, and it didn't really need to be remade. But David Bowie did such a fantastic job with that song. Niall did such a fantastic job with that song. It was a great exercise in actually remaking a song and totally fit the album. But I want to talk about Tina Turner, right? Her 1984 Private Dancer album was huge. And that's another 70s artist who made the transition in 1984. And I remember being a kid and hearing everybody saying, oh, it's Tina's comeback, it's Tina's comeback. And so to me, like, that album, why I'm mentioning it, that was like sort of the big 80s, all encompassed. You had Tina with the big hair, an album full of big songs with top songwriters, top musicians, top producers. The title track written by Mark Knopfler. She remade a David Bowie song from his 1984 album. So that's just another example of a 70s artist who made it big in the 1980s, but specifically in 1984.
I mean, I think you're right about that. I have the 1983 and 1984 top 10 songs in the Billboard Hot 100, and let's right in front of me here. And What's Love Got to Do with It was number 2 on the year in the Billboard Hot 100 in 1984. That record was just massive. I mean, Tina Turner kind of existed on the outskirts of my consciousness. I was all of 13 or 14 when we were 13 or 14 when that record.
She was on MTV a lot, though.
Came out. But that was the thing for our generation. That was our introduction to Tina Turner, and then we traced steps backwards to her partnership with Ike Turner and Rollin' on the River, and the amazing soul records that she made before she reinvented herself in 1984. My favorite track off that record, the Private Dancer record, remains Better Be Good to Me, that she recorded with Cy Kernan and Jamie West Oram of The Fix, because it's got that really wonderful jangly guitar sound on it. And then once I figured out that The Fix were on that record, it made perfect sense, because it sounded so much like Reach the Beach and the records The Fix were making at that time, who, by the way, were a fantastic band in their own right, who had Reached the Beach in 1984.
That's right. Yeah, they were awesome. And, I want to give props to Tim Capella, the sax player with the big muscles, but we can't talk about him because that was in all the Mad Max songs in 1985. So in 1983, there were a lot of 80s artists who had big hits, big albums, but then in 1984, they became massive supernovas. So you look at the Thompson Twins, right? 1983, they released Quick Step and Sidekick. Lies is such a fantastic song, one of my favorites. Love on Your Side, another one that I love so much. But then, in 84, Into the Gap came, and Hold Me Now, which was just huge, and Doctor Doctor. So those two songs alone. And the same thing happened with Madonna, right? In 1983, she released her self-titled Madonna album. Great songs. Everybody, Burning Up for Your Love, Borderline, Holiday, Lucky Star, right? All fantastic hits. But then in 1984, it blew up huge with the Like a Virgin album, right? And
every girl we went to high school with had crucifixes and black fishnets and the jelly bracelets. Yeah, it was more than music. It was a cultural moment.
Right, and we can't talk about the 80s without talking about Madonna and her cultural influence in so many ways in that decade.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's that image of her rolling around on the floor at the first VMAs in 1984 singing Like a Virgin and, sort of scandalizing the crowd but it put her on the map, and she went from this kind of downtown New York club girl to the biggest pop star on the planet. And again, this was the Nile Rodgers production on that, and she really, she came in there with the songs and really firm ideas of what she wanted to do, but also trusted Nile Rodgers and trusted the musicians and Chic to make her songs into something just massive.
Right, and I think the same thing happened with Duran Duran. Like in 1983, they released Seven and the Ragged Tiger, and the single was Union of the Snake. But then in 1984, I mean, once the Reflex came out, they were just
another Nile Rodgers remix.
That's right.
By the way.
That's right. The song actually, the album version didn't have the gusto and the vibe that it had until Nile took over that song. And then they released Arena and Wild Boys, and so you look at a lot of these bands, and 83 was a big year for them, but then 84 was just like immense.
You're absolutely right about that. Again, I pulled the Billboard Hot 100 top 10 songs for those 2 years. And you look at 1984, you had number one song of the year, When Doves Cry by Prince. Number 2, What's Love Got to Do with It? Number 3, Say, Say, Say by Paul McCartney. Number 4, Footloose. Number 5, Against All Odds by Phil Collins. Number 6 is Jump. Number 7 is Hello by Lionel Richie. Number 8, Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes. 9, Ghostbusters, and 10, Karma Chameleon by Culture Club. But I want to go back, Stephen, I think, and explore a theme that I raised at the beginning, is that you had all of these massive chart bands, the bands that we all think of when we think about the 1980s. But bubbling underneath all of that was just extraordinary stuff that have now become as much of kind of like the fabric of what we think about when we think about the 80s as those big bands. So you look at the English indie charts in 1983, you have Blue Monday by New Order, Nobody's Diary by Yazoo, This Charming Man by The Smiths, Get the Balance Right by Depeche Mode. You zoom over to 1984, you get What Difference Does It Make, again by The Smiths. You get Spirit Walker from The Cult. You have other New Order albums. So as much as that stuff was happening in kind of the US charts, as much as that was blowing up big, the stuff that we've also come to think of as sort of foundational to the 80s was bubbling up underneath. And it wasn't until the passage of 10, 15, 20 years where that stuff was put on the same pedestal artistically and commercially as a lot of these bigger bands. And part of that is the prism of nostalgia. It's movie and television show soundtracks, that kind of stuff were really kind of penetrated and became part of the mass consciousness.
That's right. And in 1983, 1984 brought a lot of great new wave songs. And 1984 specifically brought two songs that were, I guess you would say, the new wave Stairway to Heaven. Killing Moon by Echo and the Bunnymen and How Soon Is Now by the Smiths, right? I would consider those the Stairway to Heaven of like goth and alternative music. because really that's what they were in 1984. You had Footloose, you had Ghostbusters, you had all this great new wave music, a lot of it coming in from England that balanced out, like the Dan Hartman, the O'Sherry, the Rebel Yell, Flesh for Fantasy. It was a really good mix, and I know that you and I back in those 2 years were like obsessed with English culture and all the English bands and going to the import section of the record stores. I think for us both, like it all culminated with Band-Aid Do They Know It's Christmas, because right through 83 and 84, like we kept up with all these great bands, read the magazines, listened to the music, bought the EPs and the 12 inches, and then they were all in the same room. I think that's why 84 is such a special year for me, because not only did a lot of great music came out, but they ended it with the bang.
Yeah, and you could argue that was the beginning of the end of that great flowering of English pop music going into 1985. The sonic terrain really shifted. Duran Duran were off the board. Culture Club, I don't think, put out another record until 1986. So you had other sort of bands move into that gap. But again, I want to go back and just point out that in the United States, we're talking about all of these English bands with the haircuts and great singles and synthesizers, but this also was the flowering of traditional college radio in the United States, which is I was probably a little bit more deeply into than you were. 1983 saw the release of Murmur by REM, their debut album. Radio Free Europe talked about the Passion, a record that remains as wonderfully weird 40 years after its release as ever. 1984 saw the release of their sophomore album Reckoning, which remains to this day my favorite REM record. There is Let It Be by The Replacements in 1984, Afoot by Let's Active in 1983, Zen Arcade from Husker Du, Medicine Show from the Dream Syndicate, Native Sons from the Long Riders, pardon me. So happening underneath all of that, again, was this wonderful diversity of artists who never really broke through on commercial radio. It took REM until 1989 before they scored, that major label breakthrough with Green, and other artists who remain as influential as ever, perhaps without the commercial penetration, but also sort of contributing to the diversity of those 2 really wonderful years.
And that's what made the 80s so great, right? Is that you had a lot of this indie music to listen to, as well as all the new wave stuff, as well as all the pop stuff. And like we mentioned before, there were a lot of curveballs going on in music too. I think of like some of the duets that were happening. Do you remember in 84, Julio Iglesias and Willie Nelson, All the Girls I Loved Before? And just a crazy, who put those guys together? Then Kenny and Dolly, that was a little bit more mainstream, right, in the country vein. And then Mike Reno and Ann Wilson with Almost Paradise. So
the song that powered millions of junior high school dances. Yes.
Right. And, that brings me to like some of the great power duets that were on the radio at that time. We mentioned Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney before. Up Where We Belong, right? Joe Cocker and Warner, right? Just huge
Warren,
power ballads, sure. Like Baby Come to Me with Patty Austin, James Ingram, Tonight I Celebrate My Love for You, Roberta Flack, and Peeble Bryson, which I still sing around the house. There was a really diverse mix of music going on in the 80s. Not so much on MTV, like you mentioned, but on the radio. And I think it was just like a great decade to discover music. You could put a couple of German songs on from Falco, and De Commissar, which was that Golden Earring?
After the fire. That was their one and only singles. They remade that as an English language version.
Right.
Golden Earring had Twilight Zone, who themselves were a 1970s German hard rock band. Speaking of German hard rock bands, the Scorpions broke through that year with "Rock You Like a Hurricane." You had also going on, Steve, that year. The beginning of the hair metal. You had Rat with Round and Round. You had Quiet Riot covering Slade's "Come On Feel the Noise." Motley Crue put out "Shout at the Devil," and that got me to thinking about how tribal the decade was as well.
Tribal, how so?
Everyone had their lane, right? You had your new wave kids. You had your heavy metal kids. You had your You had your country kids, you had your album rock kids. I mean,
That's right.
everyone sort of like knew their lane. Everyone had their lane.
And that was like so apparent in high school, like where you had like the heavy metal guys with the denim jackets. They were hanging outside the school on the side, and you know, then you had the new wave kids with the funny looking hair, and you had
the hardcore kids, the punk kids.
It was all over the place. But somehow MTV all kind of brought it together. Not so much in the R&B and rap field in that decade, but in all the subgenres of like pop and rock, we all had our niche, and that was the great thing about it. And that's why we could talk about all these different genres of music throughout these years, because this is the All About 80s Music podcast. It was a very fertile decade. And you mentioned something before about how 1983 and 1984 were such great years for music. But in 1985, I think we sort of saw pop music at least go in another direction. I mean, hair metal kept marching through into the early 90s before Pearl Jam killed it all. You know, a friend of mine once said he thought that there was this big, great spaceship that was hovering over popular music and rock and roll, like from the 50s all through the 60s, 70s, and in 85, early 85, it sort of made its descent. And I agreed with him. Like, we had such great music in 1983, if you look at that list of songs. But as soon as like Footloose came out and Ghostbusters and the Reflex and Safety Dance and Talking in Your Sleep, and 1984 was such a great year that Van Halen named their record 1984. Just like how 1977 was a great year and the Talking Heads named their album 77. You know, it was a sort of pivotal year for the 80s, and I think that reflected a lot.
I think what you saw in part was kind of an artistic and creative exhaustion. You know, the record labels, as I said a couple of minutes ago, they ran out to sign the next Culture Club, they ran out to sign the next Duran Duran, they ran out to sign the next Spandau Ballet or whomever. The problem was that none of those bands really ended up being the next Culture Club or the next Police or the next Duran Duran. They were sort of paler copies of that. I mean, granted, you had some really great records that came out in 85. You had songs from The Big Chair by Tears for Fears, for instance. But I mean, let's face it, Go West are not Duran Duran. They were a good band, but you know, they were not quite of the same league. And you know, record labels have a history of doing that. And I think, again, Steve, this is probably the last great flowering of big music and big labels that we would see for a while. By the time we got to 1988, 1989, the air had really gone out of it. Music changed. Rap was in its ascendancy. Dance music was in its ascendancy. And a lot of these 80s artists, like, you know, they struggled to make the leap, and a great many of them did not. Some did, some did not. And music changes and shifts and moves on until, you know, finally the wheels came off the industry entirely in the late 1990s with Napster and file sharing, and in the early aughts rather entirely. So I think it was a really pristine and golden time for music, but invariably the desire to keep the gravy train rolling, I think, kind of sucked some of the artistic air out of the back half of the decade.
That's really well put. From 1985 to 1989, we saw the 80s music change. The drums got a lot harder. The sounds got a lot harder.
I hate that 86, 87 drum noise. Those horrific gated drums. I hate them with the fire of 1,000 suns.
What song do we always talk about that you hate?
Everyone Have Fun Tonight by Wang Chung. That song is a blight on popular music.
I mean, I have to disagree with you on that. One of the greatest songs ever written, but you know,
and we built the city,
that.
Which makes me want to chew broken glass.
One of the greatest songs ever written.
No.
What's that other song I love that you hate? Josie's on a Vacation Far Away.
Oh, The Outfield.
The Outfield.
Your Love. Yeah,
Your Love.
It's not bad, but it's got that horrific drum sound on it, which just kills.
That's what made it so special. That's what made it so special.
It's horrible.
But that's okay. We could disagree, right?
Yes,
and that's cool. I remember like once Scritti Politti came, the Scritti Politti songs, those like
Cupid
When in Rome, like
88. Yep.
Living in Oblivion song. You know, a lot of like the harder sounds, and that kind of made way to like the 90s and the 90s sounds and 90s hip hop and techno, and it took a whole different thing.
Yeah,
but
I think grunge sounded the final death knell for all of that in 91. Yeah.
So, and talk to any hair metal guy.
Yep.
We all talk about, I'm part hair metal guy.
They killed it stone dead. Yeah.
Yeah. But, thank God in 1983, we had Electric Avenue. We had Maneater.
Eddie Grant. Yep. Uh-huh.
We had Rock the Casbah. We had Separate Ways by Journey. Like, you'll never hear those songs again. That's such a sad thing. Just to touch on what you said about those gated drums. Now, I know you hated the gated drums on some of those songs that you mentioned, but we look at those Phil Collins songs, right?
He was putting out a record every 15 minutes. It felt like in those years.
Right. Well, he was
everywhere. Yes.
Right. So Phil Collins
Peter Gabriel started the gated drum sound.
Right.
Yes.
Right. We know that. And Phil Collins kind of brought it to the masses, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're okay with those Phil Collins drums and those power station drums as far as like gated drums go. Right.
There was still something organic about the playing. If you listen to the difference between Phil Collins playing on some of his solo stuff and Tony Thompson playing on the Power Station record, and then you put it alongside that horrific Wing Chun album or that horrific Starship record, it's the difference between night and day. It also had that horrible slamming synth bass sound on it, which also drives me to distraction. But I will defend Dance Hall Days by Wang Chung unto death from a couple of years earlier, because that's just a sort of a classic 80s new wave track.
I know you like that song. What about Let's Go? Okay. Dance Hall, you're a Dance Hall Days pure.
Dance Hall Days or die. That's it.
Listen, I'm glad we had Phil Collins and that gated reverb drum sound. I mean, because what would the last Let's Dance album be without that sound, right?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree.
That drove that album. Phil Collins and Lionel Richie basically, to me, owned that big 80s sound, big songs, big production, big songwriters. It embodied everything, like, as far as big 80s go.
I think before we go out and make that final call, I want to actually just point out the fact that it was a golden era for perfect 7-inch singles. Bands who dropped one or two great singles and maybe didn't put out consistently great records, but put out some golden singles. So you had Too Shy by Kaja Gugu. You had 99 Red Balloons from Nena. You have Relax from Frankie Goes to Hollywood. You had some great Art of Noise tracks. You had Send Me an Angel from Real Life. I could go on and on. And by the way, someday I will devote an entire podcast to that Real Life album because I love it to death. But just some really golden moments in the 7-inch format that really flourished and also sort of contributed to the specialness of those 2 years.
That's right. I want to mention my buddy Taco, Putting on the Ritz. Huge single, international single.
Cover of a 1930s swing song, which is just what the
guy's a genius.
Yep.
He's just a genius. He took that and he made it his own.
And he was Dutch. God bless him.
And he still lives in Germany from what I know online. I follow him online. We talk. He sends me jokes all the time. He's awesome. Anybody who doesn't follow Taco on Facebook, follow Taco.
That's hilarious.
Absolutely hilarious. He's awesome. And you can kind of discover all the, like, his body of work through Facebook. It's just fantastic. Opened up a new world for me. Anyway, I want to mention before we wrap it up, the Electric Dream Songs by Giorgio Moroder and Phil Oakey that came out in 1984. And I'm calling this out specifically because that song to me sounded like the goodbye for great 80s music. It has this sadness to it. It's almost like like some songs that you hear from Journey or other palette ballads, they remind you of the prom. This to me is like saying goodbye to the 80s. Like you had all these from like 1980 to 1984. You had fantastic music. You had the 80s movies. You had the songs that were in the 80s movies that like got played on the radio. I mean, it was just a fantastic 4 years. And then Electric Dreams came out, and it's sort of like the big goodbye.
Yeah, and that was sort of the last great moment for the Human League for a fair few years as well. They were huge with Dare and Don't You Want Me in 1982. You couldn't escape that song. They put out the Fascination EP in '83. Songs like Mirror Man and Keep Feeling Fascination on it. Great songs, but perhaps not in the same realm as Don't You Want Me. Then they came out with Hysteria in 1984. A fair to middling record, and you could make a decent argument. I think that Electric Dreams is the best Human League album the Human League never made.
That's right.
And then, they disappeared for a little while and came back with that Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis produced record Crash in 86. And again, that was where the music had turned and the sounds were different. So that does feel like a bit of a capstone as a single. I agree.
So we're going to wrap it up now. Looking at 1983 and 1984, what's your final verdict on those years?
Some of my favorite records came out in 1983. Some of them were big pop records. This year we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the release of True by Spandau Ballet, the 40th anniversary of the release of Murmur by REM, and Afoot by Let's Active that also came out in 1983. You look at that top 10 list in 1983, you had Down Under by Men at Work, you had Total Eclipse of the Heart, you had Maneater, you had Maniac, you had Sweet Dreams by the Eurythmics. I'm gonna be Team 83 for this week's podcast, Steve.
Really, your final verdict, 1983.
I'm going Team 83. Even though I will say that 1984 gave me my favorite REM record in Reckoning, there's just something that remains the music was still dark and mysterious. By 84, we began moving into more bleakly commercial territory. So I'm Team 83.
Okay, and I understand that. 83 was Kashagugu with Limal, and 84 was Kajagugu with Nick Beggs. So yep. I got you on that.
Oblivious by Aztec Camera, Get the Balance Right, Blue Monday. Yeah, I'm going Team 83.
I'm going to go 1984, and there are a lot of reasons. You look at all Cyndi Lauper's songs. 1984. Ain't Nothing Gonna Break My Stride. Sunglasses at Night.
Oh, that's
Jump.
That song.
Owner of a Lonely Heart. Lionel Richie's Hello. Dan Hartman, I Could Dream About You, If I Can't Hold You Tonight. Oh, Sherry. Great songs from the Cars. Caribbean Queen, Head Over Heels by the Go-Go's, Fresh for Fantasy, all wrapped up with Band-Aid. Do They Know It's Christmas at the very end? I'm going with 1984.
I do love that 12-inch Band-Aid. I have the Band-Aid 12-inch. So, yes.
So there you have it. John is with 1983, and Steve is Team 1984.
It's John. Thanks everybody for tuning in this week. We'll be back really soon to test your patience and your 80 knowledge of 80s trivia. Thanks for listening.
That's right. Play along with us next time. Okay, and this is Steve. So for next time, keep it cool, keep it awesome, and keep it totally rad.